It's the special chair.
More special as what?
I think we're going to go ahead and start class. The pop quiz to start with is how many kids are in your graduating class? We're going for the high number and the low number. So ponder that for a minute. There's handouts. Does anybody need any handouts? We had the same ones from last week. Do you want one, Travis? You guys did really good and didn't sit at the pink tables. I'm proud of you. It was more than just an idle threat there, I think you might. Okay, we'll start with you guys. Graduating class.
300.
55 and 300 and something. How about you ladies? 18? Ooh, there's a low number. 250. Okay. Ray, your table, you and John. You didn't graduate from school. I've always wondered if, John, how about you? Seven?
That was including my brother who walked the year like by himself.
Wow, okay. Well, you might have the prize, I don't know. And then my lovely wife, Terry. 850.
Where were you? Oh, okay.
The year after that, they had that.
Oh, okay. 800 senior.
It's Passel, isn't it?
Where played Craig?
28. You beat your mom. Ha ha! Korea? 300 and something. Forrest? Ruth? 200 and something.
Yeah, we graduated about 320.
Okay.
65.
65. Are you guys playing or ignoring us? Plead the fifth.
Kindergarten.
Okay, so we had a 7 and a, well, John and Terry probably won the prize. It's a raffle to be given out at a later date. Let's have I haven't even got my thing going. I didn't test. So we're in the middle of Mike's circular curriculum. He got through teaching the class on deity, and we're on the second portion of the Bible. Is that me beeping? Can you hear that? See if it works. Yeah, it works. Okay, so that's where we're at. We're going to take just a brief review from last week, is what we talked about. The Bible and the claims it makes. Claims it's a message from God. And we looked at Exodus early on in the Bible, second book in the Bible. It says God spoke all these words. That's to Moses, right, at the giving of the 10 Commandments, and then subsequently the civil laws. The book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible. These are the true words of God, an angel speaking to the Apostle John. And then 2 Timothy, all scripture is inspired. I had a discussion with a guy up in Montana one time that came up to me and said, you know, the Old Testament is not inspired. And I just, you know, when some people say things that are just so off the wall that you just think, and I didn't have a good response, but that would have been a good response because that's Paul talking to Timothy, but a good part of the New Testament wasn't even written at that time, right? So in large part, he's probably talking about the Old Testament. So all scriptures inspired, Paul writing to Timothy. 2 Peter, I was going to read those two real quick again. 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. But know, this is the Apostle Peter talking, but know this, first of all, that no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation. For no prophecy was ever made by an act of human will, but men moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God. And then also in 2 Timothy, all Scripture is inspired by God. Again, 1 Corinthians, it's not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. So that's what the Bible claims. Part of what we're doing is going through and looking at, is that right? Is that true? Can we count on that? And hopefully by the time we're through this section of the curriculum, you'll say, man, yeah, that has to be that way. It logically can't be any other, there's no other options. So we talked about that. And then we were looking at the books in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We talked about the difference between BC, before Christ's birth, and AD, after his birth, Latin, Anno Domini. The time frame for the Old Testament and the New Testament being written, the Old Testament written over a period of 1,100 years. And then there's a period of 400 years of silence, and then the New Testament was written over about 55, 60 years. Okay? We talked about the law. That's so I think I gave you too much stuff last week and made it confusing. We're on page 2 of your big handout, the back page of this. Then I also gave you a fill in the blanks. And we're going to do the fill in the blanks at the end of class. So you don't have to worry and try to keep up with that as we're going along. And then the other handout I gave you had Old Testament supplement on it. Okay, and that's where we were last week. We looked at the one front page of that, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is referred to as the law, sometimes called the Pentateuch. Also, the Torah. Okay, we talked about Genesis, beginnings of things, has the flood in there, has a record of Abraham and his sons, etc. Exodus is the leaving of the people that have been captured in Egypt, and Moses' actions to get them out of Egypt, and the plagues and all that good stuff. I can't get the papers. There you go. Thanks. Leviticus is sorry, Davey, I'm moving around. It's the regulations for the Levitical priesthood. Moses and his brother Aaron were both from the tribe of Levi, and that's the tribe that God has destined to become the leaders in the Mosaical law and the temple, etc. So that's what Leviticus is. Numbers is written by Moses also, begins with the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and that ends with them in the plains of Moab. So Exodus is Scott. These first 5 books, even though they're part of the law, they are historical, right? They're chronological and in the history of God's people. And then Deuteronomy is a retelling of the law, and it ends with Moses' death. So he doesn't make it into the promised land, but he passes the torch on to his sidekick. What would you call him? His uh, person that supports him a great deal throughout his whole life, or part of his life anyway, Joshua. And that's where we are. We're on the back page of your handout. The book of Joshua talks about the conquest of Canaan. So they're going to cross the Jordan River and go into Canaan, and then that's the promised land that God, way back when, has told Abraham they're going to get. I have on here written by Joshua. There's confusion about that. Some people say part of it was written by Joshua, so you can put a question mark by that, or you can scratch it out if you want to. We don't know for sure, I guess, totally, but it is the count of his work in leading the Israelites into the promised land. You'll remember Joshua, he was in Egypt originally as one of the slaves that was released that Moses led out of there. And if you remember the original story, when they're about to go into the promised land, they've crossed the Red Sea. I'm supposed to be up here at 1,000 feet so I don't get into forest business, but anyway, so they've crossed the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, and then Moses sends these 12 spies, right? One from each of the tribes. We're going to go look at the land, make sure it's what we want, everything, and so, you remember the song from Bible class? 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 chose wrong, and 2 chose right. And the 2 that chose right Joshua was one of them, and the other one was Caleb. And they came back and said, hey, man, this is a great land. Let's go take it. God's with us. And the 10 other guys said, no, well, we can't do that. They're too big. They're too scary. So that led them off into the wilderness for disobedience. But that's who Joshua is. He's a servant of God. The book begins with them camped in the plains of Moab, ready to go into the promised land, and then it ends after a series of battles. Joshua is a great boy book, right? Lots of fighting, lots of stuff going on like that. And it ends with the division of the 12 tribes and Joshua's passing. Next comes Judges. It begins with the death of Joshua, and it describes the life of the Israelites in the promised land. God will send a judge. There's 15 judges commented on in the book of Judges. People will wander away from God's plan and his desires for them and their Mosaical law and the living they're supposed to be doing, and God will send a judge to try to get them back on track. Some kind of famous judges you might have heard of is Samson. Most people have heard of Samson and Delilah and the hair and the whole thing about Gideon is another kind of famous judge. There's one of the judges is a woman named Deborah who leads the armies. So that's a brief outline of Judges. Ruth is a book named after one of the main characters. She's what one word could you use to describe Ruth? Humble. I want to say obedient, but anyway, she's caring. Yeah, that's a good one. She's a young woman who's lost her Israelite husband. She's a Moabite, and she embraces her mother-in-law and says, your people are Israelites. That's where I'm going to go. I'm going to hold on to that. And she ends up remarrying. Her lineage, she ends up being the great-grandmother of King David, and she's in the genealogy. She's an ancestor of Jesus. It talks about that in Matthew chapter 1. So, great example. First Samuel. Samuel is the last judge that we see. It begins with his birth, and it records the life of King Saul. The Israelites just had to have a king. Everybody else has a king. We want a king. We can't do. We got a good king. So Samuel appoints the king Saul, the first king, and Saul is a mixed king, I guess you could call him. And it also records the early life of David and Goliath, right? Everybody has heard that story. But it ends with the death of Saul and his sons. Saul is not, he looks great, right? He's this big, handsome, tall guy that has a head above everybody else, but he's not obedient to God and the direction of his kingship. And there's a conflict with him and David. He tries to kill David, chases him around, and David could have killed Saul but didn't. And now I'm getting too low and not back up, so I need to stop that. 2 Samuel is the record of David as a king. It starts with him becoming a king, and then it ends with his sin and numbering the people, because he wanted to see how many people he had and how strong the military was, and God wanted him to rely on him. And it doesn't matter how many people you have, God's with you. You can. The judges show that, right? One guy can defeat a whole army. First and Second Kings, two different books. There's a lot in this First and Second Kings section. It begins with David passing his kingship onto his son Solomon, okay, and David's death. It also has Solomon's death in later in First Kings. There's lots of Israelite kings that are depicted in both of these books. Good many of them are evil kings, bad kings. They embrace the local pagan belief system, I guess you could say, which actually in some of the beliefs of the folks that were living in that land that they didn't destroy like they were supposed to involved infant and child sacrifice. So it was an evil pagan kind of group that lived in some of those places. And there's many evil kings that are talked about. There's some good ones too. Elijah and Elisha are two kind of notable prophets that of God that are talked about in this book, and their actions and some of the events in their life. They didn't write any books in the Old Testament, so you have to find their comments and what they said and what they did, which is very notable in First and Second Kings. And then perhaps one of the most catastrophic things that happens is the splitting of the kingdom. Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam and another guy Jeroboam each end up with a portion of the kingdom. Solomon ends up kind of in our modern day terminology, a tax and spend kind of guy. He's wanting to build all kinds of stuff, and there's people working really hard for the money that he's collecting, and there's some rebellion going on, and Solomon allows that. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, he doesn't follow what people are advising him to do, and so I want to tax you more, and I want to do, and so there's a rebellion, and the kingdom of Israel splits. There's a northern kingdom of 10 tribes and a southern kingdom of 2 tribes, and that's recorded in these books. And then Second Kings ends because of their disobedience. First, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, God uses the country of Assyria to come in and capture them and haul them off. He exiles them in punishment to the Assyrian Empire. And then the southern kingdom is not quite so bad. He had some good kings, but eventually in another 100 years, God will use the Babylonians to come and exile them. So that's kind of Israel's history there. The northern kingdom is known as Israel. The southern kingdom is known as Judah as they split. So if you guys want to add anything to this as I'm hurrying through this, please do. First and Second Chronicles is a retelling of the history, including genealogies beginning with Adam. So it goes way back in time. There's a lot of details about David and his son Solomon's reign, in addition to the other kings throughout the Israelite time frame there. And it ends with hundreds of years of different empires conquering different empires, and it ends with the Persians who have conquered the Babylonians, and the king of Persia allows a portion, or as many that want to go, of the exiles from Judah to go back to home. They can go back to Jerusalem and they can rebuild the temple if they want to, and the walls, and so that's what happens at the end of Second Chronicles. The northern 10 tribes that were hauled off into Assyria are sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the lost tribes, because you don't ever really see them again. They're just kind of assimilated into the Assyrian culture, and they end up being the Samaritans in the region of Israel. And in the New Testament, it talks about how bad the Samaritans and the Jews get along. They don't get along at all. But there's the parable of the Good Samaritan. The lowest of low was acting the best, right? That's one of Jesus's parables. But that's what happens to them. The tribes from Judah end up going back, and I guess you could call that the remnant of the Hebrew people, the Jewish people. Esther is the story of a lady, one of the Jews that's in captivity in the Persian Empire, and she is chosen to be the queen of the Persian king. And the story is about, the book is about this evil guy named Haman that wants to eradicate the Jewish population that's in Persia, which is a lot of people. And so he has it all set and ready to go, and Esther's uncle, Mordecai, uncle, cousin.
It's the literal word, so we kind of guessed what he might have been.
Yeah. Anyway, he's kind of her father figure, if anything. Mordecai kind of looking after her, and he says, who knows if it's for such a time as this that you have to go before the king, which is a death sentence, basically, right? You go before the king, you show up, he hasn't summoned you, you just go, I want to see you. Well, you don't do that with the Persian king, that's off with your head kind of stuff. But she is brave, and she ends up saving her people. She saves the Jewish nation because of her actions. A really brave lady. And then Ezra and Nehemiah are two of the Israelite people, leaders, after the Persian king says, hey, you guys can go. So they go, and they take, over a period of years, different groups of Israelites back, and they rebuild the temple, and they rebuild the walls around Jerusalem and start that process. Okay? That's a 5-minute look at the history. Next books. So you can put your other handout away. Then we're back on page 2 of the big handout. We've looked at the history books. The next set of books is poetry. There's 5 books of poetry in the Old Testament. You've probably all heard of Job. It's a study in human suffering, right? Satan has gone before God and said, hey, I want to test Job. And so God allows that. And he has terrible things happen. He loses his family, he loses his health, he loses all of his belongings, and yet he clings to God. His wife tells him, you ought to just curse God and die. Why don't you? But he doesn't do that. So that's what that book is about. Psalms, collection of songs that Israel uses in worship. Some of those are written by David, some of them by other folks. Proverbs, study in wisdom. There's a lot of wise things in that. Part of that is attributed to Solomon, who asked God for wisdom, right? When I'm just a young guy, I'm supposed to be king. Initially, Solomon prays for wisdom. So we have short sayings. Ecclesiastes is the next book in poetry, written by Solomon. Vanity of Vanities, you may have heard. That's an interesting book and talks about the meaning of life. He concludes that you need to serve God. And then Song of Solomon is like an ancient marriage manual. Poetry. And then the last books, prophecy, are from the prophets. And these guys are kind of intermingled with the history books. Okay, these are, I think I'm time to change a slide, maybe. Not yet. Yeah. So there's the 17 prophecy books. These are prophets that actually wrote, and their books are written and saved in the Old Testament. Many of those, some of them went to the northern kingdom. God would send them, and they would tell the people, "You're drifting from God's law," and they would. That's one of their roles. They told them the punishment that was going to happen, and then they usually promised an end to the punishment. There's different groups of prophets that you'll hear. They're all called writing prophets, but sometimes you'll hear them referred to as major prophets and minor prophets. And there's not that they're more important. The major prophets aren't more important or more accurate or anything else. They just wrote longer books. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel are sometimes referred to as the major prophets. Jeremiah also wrote Lamentations, that book. I think Jeremiah is the longest book in the Bible, if you count the words, versus Psalms, which is close. But anyway, that's a depiction of a major versus a minor prophet. We'll talk more about the prophets next week in a little bit more detail when we talk about when they prophesied and during that time frame. Trying to keep my slides going. Okay, there I go. So that's a brief history of the Old Testament, the BC time period. We're going to talk about the New Testament a little bit before we run out of time. Questions about the Old Testament before we go on? The first 4 books, I don't have any handouts on the New Testament part. I thought about it, but I thought, man, you guys are buried in paper. So the first 4 books of the New Testament are referred to as the Gospels. Many times they're the book of biography of the life of Jesus, right? Written by 4 different people, really to kind of 4 different audiences. Okay. So that falls under the biography section. There's 1 book of history, and then there's several books of correspondence and 1 book of prophecy. A little bit more about the Gospels. First book, Matthew. I had some notes for me. I got to find them. Matthew was written to the Jewish audience for the most part. Matthew was one of the apostles, right? Remember the song, Matthew? Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Now you know why I'm not a song leader. But anyway, Matthew, one of the apostles, there's like 60 references to Jewish prophecies in the book. Okay, so it's the audience he's pointing at is the Jews. There's like 40 quotes from the Old Testament in there also. I think Eric probably is going to talk more about that, so I'm not going to get too detailed there. Mark is the second one of the Gospels, probably written to Gentile folks, and kind of an emphasis on Romans, because it's a shorter book, shorter gospel, and he emphasizes the power of Jesus, the power he has over everything, in the scriptures that he uses. He's not an apostle. He starts off as one of the companions of Paul on his first missionary journey. So he is active in missionary work, and then he's a younger guy. For whatever reason, he leaves them on their first missionary journey, and there was kind of a conflict between him and Paul after that, but they eventually patched up their differences. I didn't write it down or anything, but there's an interesting deal. It's only in Mark, I believe, about when Jesus was arrested. He's also known as John Mark, and there's a scene at the arrest that he seems to be there. I didn't write the scripture reference, but you can look it up in the end of the book of Mark, that he is tried to be captured and he runs right out of his clothes. He escapes, but just barely. But he is not one of the apostles. Luke, he's known as the beloved physician. Colossians 4:14 talks about him. He's not an apostle either, but as physicians are, he's very, very detailed. It's probably the most complete gospel of Christ's life. Okay, and that's what you would expect from someone that's highly educated. He also wrote the book of Acts. Okay, the history of the early church, as we'll talk about that in a minute. And then John. John is an apostle. He refers to himself actually as the one who Jesus loved in his gospel. His gospel is, a lot of people consider that to be the deepest and most spiritual book in the Bible. And John's gospel is a little bit different than the other three, largely written to Gentiles as a whole, to Christians throughout the world. Oh, I guess I'll have to talk louder. Davy's got it, Mike, I think. So, John is the author, in addition to the gospel. He's going to write the epistles, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John down below, and also the book of Revelation. If you remember, there's a scene at the cross. Christ is crucified, and he looks down and he sees John, and he says, this is your mother. He's talking about Christ's own mother. He says, from now on, this is your mom. And so John takes Christ's mom as and he takes care of her, which is interesting because Jesus has some half brothers and sisters, but that was the relationship that Christ had with John. Really fascinating book. Book of Acts. It's the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. It starts with the ascension of Jesus after he's risen from the dead, and then they pick a new apostle because Judas has hanged himself, and that's recorded here in Acts. And then we have the first gospel message preached by Peter on the day of Pentecost, and the other apostles also speaking in foreign languages that they didn't know. But people had all gathered, Jews had all gathered to Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. And that's the start of the church. It records thousands of people being baptized and stuff for the forgiveness of sins. And then you'll see in Acts, early on, the Holy Spirit that the apostles have been given, which is they have miraculous abilities, okay? And that, what you'll see lots of miraculous things happening, people healed, even someone brought back from death. And so you'll see that early in the book of Acts. You'll see apostles imprisoned. James is killed, one of the apostles. And then as Acts moves forward, you end up with Stephen being stoned, and this guy named Saul there. He's a zealous Jew that is persecuting the church. And he's holding all the coats while they're stoning Stephen, who's one of the early Christians. And Paul heads off to Damascus to persecute the church. And then maybe you've heard the story, you know, Christ comes to him, strikes him down, makes him blind. And so Saul becomes Paul, and he's one of the greatest missionaries of all time, right? And then the remainder of Acts records his multiple missionary journeys throughout Asia Minor and Greece and etc. So that's the book of Acts. And then you get into correspondence. Paul would go on his missionary journeys and plant churches at different places. And then he would write to them as he was on maybe his second missionary journey. A lot of times he would write to them from prison, because he was in prison multiple times. So you have a series of correspondence from Paul, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, all the way through 2nd Thessalonians. Those are written to specific churches and were likely shared with each other. Then you have specific letters where he wrote to individuals. Timothy and Titus and Philemon. And those are specific things that he addresses with them. Those were also shared. Timothy and Titus have qualifications for elders and leadership in individual churches. So he specifies that and is encouraging. 2 Timothy is likely the last letter we have written from Paul before he's beheaded. He's imprisoned in Rome, and Nero eventually beheads Paul, late 60s. Then you have some books that are called the general letters sent to the church at large. Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and then the epistles from John. Hebrews talks a lot about Christ and how he's more as a priest, as a king, compared to the Jewish Mosaical law. So it talks a lot about that. It's kind of, people think Paul wrote it, but nobody's for sure. James is an interesting book. It was written by Christ's half-brother, James, who's very active in the church at Jerusalem. Okay. 1st and 2nd Peter, again, written by the apostle Peter. And then 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, also written by the apostle John. And then Jude, the last book right before prophecy, is also written by Christ's half-brother, another one of his siblings, I guess you could say. Okay. Last book is Prophecy. And that's the book of Revelation written by the Apostle John. Um, and he's taken up and has visions of very symbolic stuff. There's dragons and there's things that are hard to understand, and there's all kinds of stuff in there. Very apocalyptic language and stuff like that. And so it's a warning. It's ultimately to encourage the persecuted Christians at that time. That's at the very end of the apostolic age, which is about 100 AD. And John will pass. He's historically the only apostle that dies a natural death, is not martyred for his belief system. Okay, questions? Whiz through the Bible real quick. We're almost out of time. I was going to go through the handout that you have with the blanks real quick. And I've lost mine. So I don't know how many of you guys have already done this. The major division of the Old Testament: law, history, poetry, and prophecy. There's 4 divisions. You can see those on your screen. The book of the law. Why are they called that? Because it's Mosaical laws included in there. Number 3, the following book match the books of the law with the meaning of their titles. You can get that from your paper. Genesis is the beginning. Exodus is the account of Israel's exit from Egypt. Leviticus is laws pertaining to priests. And then the census is Numbers, and Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. List the Old Testament books of history whose titles reflect the name of their main characters. You can get that from up there. It's also in your handout. And then there's Old Testament history books. What do they start with and what do they end with? And they start with the first book, the conquest of Canaan in Joshua. And then they end with the Israelites returning to the promised land after they've been captured. Match the books of poetry. Job is suffering. Psalms is songs. Proverbs is wisdom. Ecclesiastes is preacher, and Song of Solomon is marriage. List the prophets who are listed. I'm not going to read them all to you, but you can write those down from your handout. And the prophet's duty was to speak for God, right? And then the communications is, you need to turn from this. And then here's what's going to happen if you don't, and here's what will happen after you do. New Testament is biography, history, correspondence, and prophecy, the different number 9 there. The first 4 books are known as the Gospels, which means the good news. And they're the biographical treatments of the life of Christ. One history book, which is the book of Acts, and it talks about the early church and Acts of the original apostles as they spread the church. Correspondence go to certain towns and to certain people, and that's in your handout as well. And then the general letters written by James, Peter, John, and Jude. Prophecy is Revelation, and John wrote that. Talks about future outcome of the church and persecuted Christians. How many books are in the Bible? Remember how we remembered that? You count Old and you count Testament, and Old is 3, and Testament has 9 words in it, or 9 letters in it, so that's 39. And then Walt was forgetting his 9 times tables, but if you multiply 3 times 9, you get 27, and that's the number of books in the New Testament. That's not biblical or anything, that's just a cheat on how to remember that. So there's 66 books total. 5 law, 12 history, 5 poetry, and 17 prophecy. And then biography, the last one is there's 4 biography, 1 history, 21 correspondence, and 1 prophecy. Next week, we'll talk about the different, as the Bible was written, under what groups of people and empires that it was written under. And that's about where we're going to stop today. Any comments, or you have time for coffee before church?